2023 was an interesting year, mainly in that I didn't fill out my bottom 10 list until the tail end of the year. Normally, I fill it out as I am seeing new releases. Maybe it's because I've mellowed out in my 30s, but even the bad movies that I saw through most of the year didn't really bother me that much. Things like Family Switch, The Family Plan, Five Nights at Freddy's, Magic Mike 3, Expendables 4, movies that many critics have rated as their worst. They may not have been of the best quality, but they never really pissed me off either. As my bottom movies retrospective video will show, once I've finished it, I've seen some shit in my decade plus of covering movies, so my bar for this list is pretty damn low. Still, every year always has enough movies to at least fill out 10 spots, so let's get into Deer and Projector Lights Bottom 10 Movies of 2023. Number 10. Despite how much the pandemic has affected the world at large, Hollywood hasn't really addressed it in their movies. We had a couple of movies about the lockdowns, but for the most part, Hollywood productions take place in this alternate universe where the pandemic never actually happened. Part of that getting back to normal bullshit that people in charge have been pushing. Granted, when Hollywood does acknowledge the pandemic, it's in garbage like this. Originally shot during the lockdowns, Life Upside Down is purportedly about some well-to-do people in Los Angeles as the lockdowns throw their routines and relationships into disarray. But what it actually is cheaper looking than The Asylum. How do you look cheaper than the studio best known for making cheap knockoffs and yet get access to Bob Odenkirk, Radha Mitchell, and Danny Houston? Did they owe this director a favor or something? This director who isn't even important enough to get a Wikipedia page about them, and whose last work was 16 years ago? Neil Breen does better camera work than this movie. What this reminds me of mostly is one of my least favorite movies from 2021, Malcolm and Marie. Most people were at least lukewarm on the movie or took umbrage with the age difference between John David Washington and Zendaya, which is at least a decade apart. But my reason for it being on the list was that these people are fucking boring. I'm sorry, but rich people from Los Angeles, especially ones who work in entertainment, are just inherently boring to me. For as much as Euphoria was at least able to garner people's attentions enough to talk about it, Malcolm and Marie is a joyless slog that wastes your time forcing you to watch this shallow industry couple fight all night long. But at least Malcolm and Marie was annoying enough to elicit an emotion out of me. This movie can't even do that. It's literally just a bunch of stuff that happened. And that's not saying that character pieces are inherently boring. Some of the best dramas are character studies. I still feel like we're overdue for a Death of a Salesman adaptation, especially given how bad things have been since the 2008 recession. Hell, any halfway decent writer could make these rich jagoffs into compelling characters, which just means that the industry is platforming too many less than decent writers. The characters in this movie aren't interesting at all. They got good actors to portray boring characters or just vapid rich Angelinos in boring-ass marriages and having boring-ass affairs. Even the cheating is boring. How did you make infidelity boring? I think the saddest thing is that after a year where movies that had great word of mouth, like Batgirl and Coyote vs. Acme, were binned for the studios to make a quick buck, this list has 2 movies that sat on the shelves for 3 years before finally getting unceremoniously dumped on an unsuspecting public. We'll get to the other one later on, but for now, let's make like anyone who watched this movie and forget we ever saw it. Number 9. Bill Burr's as a comedian, I kind of fall in and out of being a fan of. At first glance, he comes off as another douchey, angry white guy comedian that you've seen a million times, but he often recognizes that the reactionary rhetoric of angry white guys is for what it is. Straight up ignorance and bigotry. He's one of the few people to have pushed back against shows like Bill Maher and Joe Rogan when they're talking out of their asses about stuff, and can be pretty insightful at times. And then there's this movie. When it comes to Burr and a lot of comics to have come out of that 80s stand-up bubble, as they got older, their big thing was complaining about how coddled and weak younger generations are, and how they need to toughen up. Probably because they mistook Carlin's rails against political correctness as him complaining about people needing to be tougher, when he was against obfuscating an indirect language. Meanwhile, all you have to do is show these guys Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem, and they'll throw the biggest hissy fit you've ever seen. And really, that's the problem with old dads. It's the weakest part of Burr's comedy, complaining about how things aren't like how they used to be. Plenty of generations have had clashes before. Back in the 60s, the boomers clashed with their parents and grandparents. So did Gen X in the 80s and 90s. The generational clashes aren't anything new. But honestly, I think whenever people have tried to depict them in media, it always comes off as the people making it saying, "You damn kids, you don't know how it used to be." Like, you might be able to get a rebel without a cause, but more often you get crap like this. I think he's trying to make a point about how, despite his political incorrectness, he still has some things to teach the younger generation, or maybe he's trying to lament that getting older sucks, but they still have some good times left in them. I actually don't know what the point of this movie was when most of it is just Bill Burr ranting and being angry over annoying caricatures of what people think millennial parents are like. Like, there are no actual characters here. Everyone's a glorified stereotype of a person, and I feel like nothing actually happens in this movie. Like, this is somehow even less than just a bunch of stuff that happened. What was even the point of this whole thing? All that said, I do hope Burr tries to make another movie if he wants to. Yeah, I didn't like this one, but I get the feeling he's someone who's able to look at his mistakes and learn from them. Besides, in the long line of comedians trying to make movies, Burr could be doing way worse. He's not Adam Carolla bad. Number 8. Man, this one really hurts. I've been a fan of Charlie Day's since I first started watching It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, right around when the second season was airing and Danny DeVito had joined the cast. Since then, he's proven himself to be a usually funny actor, and often the highlight of whatever he's in. The same year he made this movie, he was one of the better parts of the Super Mario Bros. Movie. And with his directional debut, he had an all-star cast featuring the likes of Ken Jeong, Jason Sudeikis, the late Ray Liotta, Kate Beckinsale, Adrian Brody, John Malkovich, Edie Falco, Dean Norris, Common, Jillian Bell. This had all the makings of a good comedy. So what the hell happened? I think part of the problem is something Todd in the Shadows brought up in his Train Records episode on Liz Phair's Fun Style.
The problem is that showbiz satires are the last refuge of the creatively spent. Way too much of the time, they come from people who've used up all their ideas except for the things right in front of their noses, and it just devolves into a tedious display of score settling and inside jokes that no one can relate to. It's an exercise for people who've been in the industry too long and need to take a long step away.
There have been some good showbiz satires, like The Producers, the original 60s one, Tropic Thunder, Singin' in the Rain, Bamboozled, but a lot of times when an artist gets to the point of making a showbiz satire, it's to vent some kind of frustrations out about their job. It's glorified workplace gossip. Judd Apatow's The Bubble is a perfect example, where the conflicts really only stem from issues filmmakers have with blockbuster studio productions and movies shot entirely on green screens on top of the pandemic interrupting a lot of productions. Honestly, if you've seen any Hollywood satire or even a biopic, you've already seen the plot of this movie. The cliches themselves are cliché, and Day playing a mute character adds nothing to the comedy. He's not a Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin type. He can't really sell silent comedy. Hell, I think he's more like Ryan Reynolds in that his best comedy comes from his voice and delivery. So this just takes away what I like most about Charlie Day. and the humor is just the worst. Day has to basically share the protagonist role with Ken Jeong because I guess they couldn't pick just one of them to be the protagonist, and Jeong can be hilarious with the right material, but without a good script behind him, he's just obnoxious. This is less like him playing Chang on Community and more like his performance in Norm of the North. But that's less Jeong's fault and more the script and direction. Day has everyone try to deliver these hyperbolic, campy, over-the-top performances, but they just aren't funny. Even if everyone wasn't acting like people who are just a bit too into community theater, the dialogue is just garbage. There's no real standout jokes, and what isn't intended to be jokes is just the worst cliche-driven hack speech writing. As a palate cleanser to this movie, I decided to watch something that I hoped would actually make me laugh and nail this sort of campy, in-on-the-joke comedy. Slaughterhouse. Now, Slaughterhouse isn't amazing or anything. Honestly, it's literally just the one joke of the killer being a sloth puppet. But the filmmakers of Slaughterhouse at least were able to work in that campy space where they know they're being stupid, and that's what makes it fun. Day is stuck between trying to be this weird classic 40s, 50s Hollywood throwback and a weirdly serious modern showbiz satire, and none of it works. Day's clearly not a bad comedy writer. He's done plenty of episodes of It's Always Sunny and co-created Mythic Quest with Rob McElhenney and Megan Gans, but this feature film debut of his just did not work. That said, like with Bill Burr, I hope Charlie Day keeps trying. Not all debuts are going to be great, but you can always learn from your mistakes and do better the next time. Number 7. As I began catching up on the year's releases in November, I finally bit the bullet and watched the Flash movie. I had avoided it for the longest time, mainly for the despicable way Warner was protecting Ezra Miller from any repercussions for assaulting and threatening multiple people and grooming teenage girls. But after the film's release, I learned of the shameful and disgraceful fan service crammed in at the end that completely steals the likenesses of 2 deceased Superman actors. But more infamously, one of the actors whose life was actually ruined by playing Superman and who hated playing the role. For context, George Reeves was cast as Superman for the Adventures of Superman TV series from 1952 to 1958. Like many actors, he began struggling to find other work after being solely known as Superman, which led him to a spiraling depression that likely led to his suicide, though there has been some debate about that given there are some inconsistencies during the investigation. There's actually a pretty decent movie about this called Hollywoodland, starring the DCEU Batman himself, Ben Affleck. So technically, Affleck has played both Superman and Batman. Fun fact for the day. The point is, George Reeves hated being typecast as Superman, and that more than likely led to his own suicide. So to use deepfake technology to make him play the role again from beyond the grave is even more despicable than just the cravenly fan service of bringing Christopher Reeves back from the dead for the same sequence. So yeah, needless to say, I wasn't in any hurry to see this. When I finally sat down to watch it, the first thing I noticed was the absolutely heinous CGI. Some effects are fine, but there's so much here that looks like abject cartoons, and scenes where people's heads are completely floating in the air on top of a CG body. The fact that this was released in this state should be unacceptable. Like, this CG would have passed in the 2000s, when the technology was so much newer and realistic renderings were a lot harder, but it's 2023. There is no reason the CGI in a multi-million-dollar blockbuster movie should look this bad. On top of that, while people have been praising Ezra Miller's performances in this movie, all I felt when they were on screen was any existing charisma being sucked out of the room. I never liked their version of Barry Allen. Their performance honestly kind of reeked of coded neurodivergence, being treated as a joke, like Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. So to have 2 annoying performances going on just grated on me the whole movie. Seriously, why do people like this person, even without knowing that they're a total piece of shit behind the scenes? But it's not like Ezra was giving grade A material either. While some of the themes they were going for were good, like the need to let go of past trauma and that you can't control everything, the execution was nowhere near as good as it's been done in other movies, even just other superhero movies. The storytelling is fine enough, but the dialogue is absolutely atrocious. Barry is almost never funny on purpose, and some of the one-liners are so bad, they're cringeworthy. There are some bright spots. Michael Keaton is good as Old Man Bruce, and I thought Sasha Calle was bad as Supergirl. She really needed better material. And there's really well-shot fight sequence between Bruce and the two Barrys set to 25 or 6 to 4 by Chicago that was really good. But those bright spots were few and far between to make this worth watching again. And if nothing else, I'm glad this completely misguided and shoddily put together franchise is done after Aquaman came out. And I can't imagine James Gunn making anything as bad as this. Number 6. I'll say this for Fool's Paradise. At least it was earnest. At least it was trying for something and failed. I can't imagine anyone trying for this one. I missed the original Vacation Friends movie when it came out, so I ended up watching both the original and the sequel back-to-back as part of my year-end catch-up. And sweet baby Jesus, this has to be one of the worst duologies ever put to film. Not a single character is likable or relatable, and despite Lil Rel Howery and John Cena both being very capable comedic actors, and Clay Tarver having worked on good comedy before with Silicon Valley, this whole endeavor is just incredibly humorless. I think the problem is these movies rely on the actors being obnoxious for the humor. Even Howery, as the straight man, is an obnoxious character. I don't know if that's just something other people find funny, but being annoying isn't the same thing as being funny to me. You know what this really reminds me of? The kind of really bad comedies Kevin Hart will do. Howery's delivery comes off more like Kevin Hart in shit like Me Time, and the pairing of him with John Cena screams like this was either intended for Hart and Dwayne Johnson, or that it's trying to go for that same effect. But Cena's himbo energy never really works here. So when the cast can't bring the humor based on their charisma, the writing needs to be extra good. But the writing here is just not good at all. The premise is fine enough. A mishap of a resort forces this odd coupling into a weird friendship, but the devil's in the details, and frankly, I just find Howery's character be kind of a shitty person. Like, aside from having to deal with his in-laws being pretentious twats, there's nothing really likable about his character. Meanwhile, Cena and Meredith Hagner are portrayed as this free-spirited, chaotic, but friendly couple, but the first thing Hagner does is slip Howery into Von Orgy, playing his soon-to-be fiancé, martinis laced with cocaine. Like, that's not aren't we wacky chaos? That's you're going to get someone killed chaos. And yet the movie goes out of its way to portray Cena and Hagner as always in the right, despite them being just as terrible as Howery. Orgy's not bad, but she's also not given much to do in these movies, especially not in the sequel. The sequel even adds more comedically capable actors like Ronnie Chiang and Steve Buscemi, and it managed to make both of them unlikable. And given how likable Buscemi is just naturally, that takes some real skill to make me not like him even a little. Shit, Buscemi's more enjoyable in Happy Madison productions than he is here. And Ronnie Chiang feels so wasted. Chiang may not be a household name or anything, but he's shown that he's capable of being funny. Watching him here, you'd think the guy didn't have a single funny bone in his body. I don't know who these obnoxious comedies are supposed to be for, other than the people getting paid to make them, but they sure as hell aren't for me. Hopefully we don't have to deal with a Vacation Friends 3 anytime soon, because I don't know how much lower the bar could go. Number 5. Stephen King adaptations can be really hit and miss. Sometimes you get a Carrie, or a Stand By Me, or a Dr. Sleep, but then you can get things like The Langoliers, or Dreamcatcher, or this remake? Reboot? Requel? Whatever it is, it sucks. This was the other movie that sat on the shelves for 3 years. It was originally made and premiered in 2020 in Sarasota, Florida, of all places, and was slated for a theatrical release in 2022, but eventually was picked up by Shudder, and honestly, I feel like that's a better fit. This is no better in quality than the countless direct-to-video sequels in this godforsaken series. This time around, instead of the child pastor Isaac, we have a pastor's daughter named Eden, who has managed to completely gain the sway of about every kid in this Nebraska town despite having less charisma than an overbaked potato. And the movie starts with buzzwords about corporate farming and agribusiness and GMOs being the reason for the town's crops being bad. Not that you could tell the difference in the quality of the corn either way. But after the townspeople vote to just destroy the crop so they can receive a subsidy, which somehow infuriates both the lead character, Boleyn, and Eden. Though Boleyn thinks that destroying the crops is bad because of the soil, she opens this movie with expositing how there's this fungal infection that's destroying the corn, but destroying the crops altogether is bad? Look, I'm from Ohio. We got a lot of corn. We have a city dedicated to corn so much that there's statues of it. But I'll admit, I don't know shit about best farming practices when it comes to corn. I also get the distinct feeling that neither do the people making this movie. Anyway, Eden and less than a dozen other kids in town manage to round up all the adults and hold a mock trial at Boleyn's request. A trial we never actually see happen. Afterwards, Eden and the kids go about murdering all the adults in town. Such as the premise of Children of the Corn. Bo tries to save who she can, but it's revealed that there's a "we have Groot at home" monster named He Who Walks, short for He Who Walks Behind the Rose, whom Eden is actually serving. The whole thing culminates in Boleyn burning the cornfields up and blowing up a shed full of tractor fuel and destroying He Who Walks, only for Eden to show up and become her own corn-based CGI monstrosity in one of the dumbest effects and plot twists I've ever seen put to film. I'll admit, around the time when I was in high school or college, I rewatched the original Children of the Corn movie with Lyndall Hamilton, and for about a month after I watched it, it actually freaked me out. Like, I was having nightmares about it, and it kept me up. It's not a fantastic movie, but it has iconic moments, and the imagery of a Lord of the Flies town where these murderous children have taken over is one that's held up to this day. And yet, every follow-up to that original movie has been consecutively worse. I listen to this podcast called Now Playing Podcast that reviews all the movies in a given series, and the host's biggest endeavor was to review all of the Stephen King adaptations, which included all of the Children of the Corn movies, and hearing them discuss these movies, it sounds like the series peaked with the first one and never got better, only worse. I'll give the lead actress, Elena Kemporis, this: she's at least trying. She's barely given anything, but she's doing her best. None of the other actors in this movie give nearly as good of a performance. Even the girl playing Eden never hits the highs that John Franklin's Isaac did. Isaac had all the mannerisms of an evangelical preacher, so you could see him forming a cult out of these kids. Eden has none of that charisma. She seems more bored than anything else. And I'll give her character this: she's such a nasty little shit that I did want to see her die by the end. But by the time it happened, I was so disappointing that it didn't matter. And really, every character besides Boleyn doesn't matter. Boleyn has these friends that are older teens who are around town until they get killed off. They don't matter. Boleyn has a disaffected brother who joins Eden. He stops mattering after the first scene. They hint at these subplots of rocky marriages and domestic abuse from the townspeople that go nowhere. Nothing in this movie matters. Oh, and let's talk about the effects, especially for Wish.com Groot. These are some bad effects, like even for a low-budget horror movie. Blumhouse movies alone have shown that you can do a lot with a low budget, and good director can rely on camera tricks and simple effects to make really powerful horror stories. You look at things like Skinamarink or Talk to Me from this year. This movie really wants to swing for the fences by having this big bad monster, but it looks so bad. It's a PS3 graphic at best, and the big effect at the end with Eden is actually laugh out loud funny bad. Like, if you don't have the money for good effects, you don't have to use the effects. You can just not do it. This movie was just too big for its own britches. I don't know if we'll ever get another decent, let alone good, attempt at the Children of the Corn story, but this did have some good starting points, addressing the influence of corporate agribusiness on farmers, the effects of climate change on farming, how small towns are losing their populations as people age out or move out. You have themes you could address with a Children of the Corn story. It's just too bad no one actually tries to. Number 4. This was the first and honestly only entry on the bottom 10 for most of 2023. Not that bad movies didn't come out, like I said, but the movies I was able to catch in theaters were either good or just okay. But this, from the premise alone, I knew this one was going to be a bad one. Here's the thing. As an atheist, I'm not against religious stories or using religious iconography. As long as the story you're telling is good, I'll at least give you that. The story here is a hot mess of biblical fanfiction, trying to make the whole war between heaven and hell a fantasy epic, but with none of the skills to do that. Shit, it doesn't help that the entire plot centers around the Shroud of Turin, which as soon as you actually dig into the scientific analysis of it, reveals it to be a complete and utter sham. And yet, even allowing for some suspension of disbelief, this movie wants us to accept that the villains are cloning Jesus from the Shroud of Turin to make the Antichrist.
This is the plan? Are you crazy? This will never work.
But like I said, if the story you're telling is good enough, dumb shit like that can be forgiven. It's just that the story isn't any good. The characters aren't compelling. The acting is as stiff, wooden, and dead as a petrified forest, and everything looks cheap as hell, including hell. This movie's version of hell is just a quarry with a blue filter. I'm sure if you panned the camera over, you'd find the Power Rangers fighting some villain of the week. Look, believe in whatever you want to believe. As long as you're not hurting anybody, it doesn't matter. But if you want to turn biblical mythology into something epic for the big screen, you're going to have to try a lot harder than this. Number 3. While I'm not a member of either group, I have been aware enough for most of my life that there's been a long-standing tension between Jewish and Black American communities. The reasons for that go far back, and me trying to break it down is well above my pay grade. But suffice it to say that you could have a Guess Who's Coming to Dinner kind of satirical comedy that tackles those issues. This movie seems to want to do that, but it's just so bad at it. I haven't seen much of Kenya Barris's other works, though I know he has a history of tackling black issues, but him working with Jonah Hill did not work when trying to address these kinds of topics. Jonah specifically is more of a dude bro humorist. His sense of humor was behind the 21 Jump Street movies. He helped with the Bryan Cranston, James Franco comedy, Why Him? And even his directorial debut, mid-90s, was more of a coming-of-age story in the SoCal suburbs. The dude is not really the kind of writer who can handle these loaded and heavy topics. So what we end up with is a comedy that is trying so hard to be taken seriously about the friction between black and Jewish people while doing 5 straight minutes on describing Jonah Hill shitting himself after snorting cocaine in Vegas, where the meet cute is an uncomfortable and contrived mess where Jonah Hill thinks Lauren London's his Uber driver, where David Duchovny's only bit in the movie is talking about Exhibit. Even without the racial tensions, this movie is just painfully unfunny. It didn't get a single laugh out of me, not even ironically. I'll admit, I've never been the biggest fan of Jonah Hill. I feel like he's always been his character from Superbad, and now he just looks and sounds like a colossal ass clown, and that's besides his history of assaulting women and being an abusive asshole. But if we're stuck with him around, the least he could do is make some good movies, and I can't remember the last time he did that. Number 2. Recently, 2 major classic properties associated with Disney entered the public domain: Winnie the Pooh and Bambi. For Bambi's entry into the public domain, I actually read it out loud on stream for my first anniversary as a VTuber on Twitch. Meanwhile, a former tech guy for the British energy company EDF took the opportunity of these IPs entering the public domain to push out a schlocky, grimdark parody of Winnie the Pooh before announcing a sequel to that, and similar parodies featuring Bambi and Peter Pan, with Peter Pan entering the public domain this year, 2024. I fully admit I'm not the biggest horror fan. There's a long-standing tradition of schlock and camp in the genre that I never fully gelled with. Some of the schlock horror movies work for me, like Killer Clowns from Outer Space or Little Shop of Horrors, but a lot of the cheaper stuff like the Jack Frost Snowman slasher movie or the kinds of things pumped out by Anchor Bay never worked for me. That's clearly what Frakes Waterfield is going for with this movie, but even in that schlocky and campy horror vein, this is just awful. You know what this feels like? A try-hard YouTube parody trailer extended to feature length. It has the production value of a mid-tier YouTube video, that's for sure. The premise tries so hard to be shocking to fans of Winnie the Pooh that it ends up being pathetic. And beyond that, it isn't even a decent horror movie. Like, I don't expect these kinds of low-budget horror movies to have stellar acting or writing. But even for the Roger Corman level of filmmaking, this is just weak. No memorable characters, not even great kills or gore, cheap production. At what point do you try so little that you may as well not even bother? Frakes Waterfield left EDF in 2021, and prior to this movie, he pumped out 36 feature-length films over that 2-year period. Pretty much all of them were put up on Tubi, but some have managed to make it to Peacock and the Roku channel as well as being available to rent and purchase, because apparently he thinks you should pay money for shit like Dinosaur Hotel, Fire NATO, Jack and Jill, and Croc! Since gaining notoriety for this movie, he's fully pivoted into grimdark parodies of kids media, not only with a sequel to this movie and takes on Bambi and Peter Pan, but he's even said he wants to tackle more notable licensed characters, like the Teletubbies and TMNT. So he seems to be all in on being Ed Wood if he were raised on 4chan and something awful, and shock people by making slasher movies with kids' IPs. He doesn't want people to take him seriously. But even as a schlock jock troll, you need to try harder than this. Go full Trauma Pictures with it. Lean in on the tawdriness and gore and camp. I'll sooner take an earnest schlock fest than a lazy cash grab any day of the week. Give me Slaughterhouse more than this. For pretty much the entire year, this was the worst thing I saw. It's the one I hated the most, but really, there was only ever one movie that was going to top it. But before we get into that, let's squeeze in a few dishonorable mentions. While David Gordon Green and Danny McBride's reboot of Halloween managed to work overall, the same formula doesn't work for The Exorcist. You can't just bring back the actors from the first movie for an extended cameo while half-assedly trying to continue the story. It's no wonder William Friedkin hated the idea so much, he told one film critic, "If there's a spirit world and I come back, I plan to possess David Gordon Green and make his life a living hell." After seeing this movie, I not only don't blame him, I fully support him.
I'm in way over my head.
I can help you, but no questions asked.
You would do that? But why?
Okay, there was 2 questions right off the line. See you tomorrow.
I didn't feel right putting this on the list proper because I wanted to save that for movies that actually pissed me off. This? I can't get mad at this. It's like getting mad at a puppy for peeing on the carpet. Not to disparage the studio behind such luminaries as Space Chimps and Charming, but this isn't peak animation. This is perfectly serviceable. That said, there is also no reason for this to be in theaters. This movie radiates with direct-to-video energy, from the lackluster performances by the voice cast, to the base-level writing, to the good enough animation. Really, aside from a neat bit that parodies the classic Take On Me music video, there isn't any reason to see this movie.
Diary of a Wimpy Kid Christmas, Cabin Fever, streaming on Disney+.
This isn't on the list proper because, honestly, the bar for this series was already in the toilet. It's not a shocker that it failed to cross it. It's the same weirdly cheap-looking, uncanny animation, all the characters are still crap, it's just now there's Christmas decorations all over it. At this point, I get the feeling fans of this series would prefer the live-action sequels to this lump of coal. This one wasn't bad enough for the list proper, but man, I'm just tired of the imperialist propaganda genre. Like, sure, before I became a full-on filthy pinko commie, I was fine with these CIA movies, but now I just can't stand them. It's like how The Conjuring made the Warrens into heroes, when the truth is they are absolutely awful. It doesn't help that even if you did like this genre, Kandahar brings nothing to the table. It doesn't really say much about the US involvement in the Middle East that hasn't been said before in better movies, and quite honestly, I don't think Gerard Butler is charismatic enough to make me care about this boring nothing of a character. This is basically the same macho tough guy character he's been playing since Olympus Has Fallen. Arguably since 300, and honestly I think that's run its course. In both my top movies and my upcoming bottom movies retrospective videos, I talk about how, while I'm an atheist, I'm not one to begrudge religious movies or their audiences. I mentioned that also with The Devil Conspiracy. But this one just got under my skin. Given it's based on a true story, I can't speak to the authenticity of what we see on screen to what actually happened, but even if everything we see on screen is true, the story being told feels more like an adaptation of a chick tract, those black and white comics that show how everything besides Jesus and obeying your parents is devil magic and will ruin your life. Because this movie basically starts as an anti-drug PSA, even before laying on the hippy-dippy Jesus part. At the same time, it works more as a dishonorable mention than a full slot in the bottom 10. It's preaching up its own ass, but it isn't near the bottom of the barrel for this genre.
You know, I read your book. So what happened with Tessa?
Another of these garbage series is finally done. Hallelujah. And they decided to end it on a limp fart of a movie where 90% of it is Hardin finally trying not to be a total piece of shit. Not through actual therapy or anything like that, but by reconnecting with another woman whose life he ruined and getting his ass kicked in by her douchebag friends. And we're supposed to give a shit for some reason. I have no idea what further horrors this genre of homeopathic Twilight will give us next, but given this was relegated to a Fathom event, hopefully it won't be subjected to us at large. Normally, people try to act above politics, like it's something dirty that's beneath them to engage with. If my adult life has taught me anything, it's that your politics are defined by your experiences, and life has only kept moving me to the left, to the point where I identify as an anarcho-communist, while 10 years ago I just called myself a progressive liberal. My politics were formed by talking with people in my various online spaces and personal spaces and seeing the state of the world around me. I bring this up because while many people don't like engaging in politics, I at the very least want to engage with it, especially when I have so many friends who are people of color, women, gay, trans, disabled, neurodivergent, people marginalized by society whose lives have been made political for nothing more than existing. I don't really engage in debate when it comes to conservatives because, one, I'm not good at actual debate, so I'm not really fit to try and debate people for real. But two, most people demanding to be debated aren't interested in a meeting of the minds, and more in being heard and taking up space, especially online. So while I can have engaging and energizing debates about politics with, say, my more conservative parents, I'm sure as fuck not giving the time of day to someone who either isn't a real person, or more specifically, isn't interested in actually talking about ideology and philosophy. What I'm gonna get is my number one is Sound of Freedom. Like how conservative country songs were skyrocketed to number one spot on Billboard by coordinated spending campaigns, 2023 saw an uber-conservative, quote-unquote biopic about this ex-CIA agent who's supposedly rescuing kids from human traffickers make a considerate box office run, eventually becoming the 9th highest-grossing movie of the year. I say quote-unquote and supposedly because, frankly, I don't think Tim Ballard deserves to be trusted at face value. For one thing, the dude is a Mormon being backed by Glenn Beck. I know individually Mormon families can sometimes be the nicest people you've ever met. I even went to school with one, and that was my experience with them at the time, but I also recognize that Mormonism, like with all religions, is also riddled with its own problems and bad actors. And combined with the fact that he's being propped up by one of the biggest conservative charlatans in recent memory, raises all kinds of red flags to me. But so this guy is a Mormon, so he's backed by Glenn Beck. At least he's helping victims of human trafficking, right?
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Yeah, people who've worked far longer and far harder in fighting human trafficking have been very vocal about how this guy's full of shit. His movie especially. For starters, victims of child trafficking, just like with most kidnappings, are targeted not by strangers or these secret cabals, but by people who actually know them. Family, friends of family, neighbors, religious leaders, people in positions of authority. Then you add in that this isn't the first and second graders being taken. The majority of victims are preteens and teenagers. Preteens and teenagers who are LGBTQIA+, especially, since they're usually already ostracized by their families and communities. But Ballard isn't concerned about them. He wants the shock value of prepubescent children being taken and abused. The biggest problem this movie and Ballard's whole agenda presents is their solution won't solve the problem. Tim Ballard wants to present himself and his organization as the solution to human trafficking with 80s action hero and spy movie aesthetics to circumvent any kind of oversight that they have by being part of a legitimate organization and act outside of any nation's government to extrajudiciously tackle the problem at its face, but never at its roots. Actual anti-trafficking activists have given their proposals for how to prevent it. And spoiler, it involves more regulations and tax-funded social programs to treat mental health and drug addiction, not putting on Rambo cosplay and calling yourself a hero. That's what puts this over Blood and Honey. Even if I treated this as just a movie, it would be one of the worst things I'd ever seen. A meandering slog that forcefully pulls at your heartstrings to try and paint Ballard as the hero bucking a slow and broken system by going rogue to save the children. And if this is just another Christian movie peddling its message, I could just leave it where it lies. A bad movie clearly not made for me, akin to Jesus Revolution. But this movie's proposed solutions to an actual real-world problem aren't going to stop it, and if anything, could make things worse. Vigilante agents and special ops missions aren't the solution to human trafficking. Tackling the roots of exploitation, which are often capitalism itself, are how we stop this problem. Like with other Christian conservative quote-unquote biopics like Unplanned or I Still Believe, this movie is only here to promote a far-right ideology. It's propaganda disguising itself as cinema, and the fact that it actually has the potential to do more harm than good is what puts it over public domain exploiting slasher movies and half-assed social commentary. Shit, if this guy was legit, his movie would have been made by an actual studio, not by the Pepsi to Pureflix's Coke. And that covers both ends of my 2023 film watching experience. I'm hoping to be a bit more active in 2024, so here's hoping this year will be better than the last, at least in one regard. Until next time, you can find me at the movies.